Bienvenidos en este segundo día de la conferencia sobre el asiento y la trata transatlántica de africanos esclavizados. And we'll now begin with the first speaker, Manuel FERNÁNDEZ CHAVES. The title of his presentation is Los contratos de Guinea y Angola y el tráfico de esclavos en el Caribe y México, redes de comercio y retorno de beneficios antes del asiento de Reinel, 1589-1595. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. No, I prefer. Bueno, hoy voy a hablar en español porque seguro que lo hago mejor que en inglés. Y seguro que se me entiende también mejor que en inglés. Aunque creo que mi inglés es básico, pero mejor hablo en español básico. Lo que traigo aquí es un trabajo sobre en torno a los contratos de Guinea y de Angola. El de Angola, diré algunas cosas al final. Contratos que se firman antes del asiento de Pedro Gómez Reinel. Es una época, la de los años 80, de cambio, de transformaciones importantes en la trata debido a la Unión Ibérica, con la concesión de licencias a los contratadores de África, tanto de Cabo Verde como después, cuando surja el contrato de Angola, para llevar directamente, como esto se ha oído por la historiografía, una serie de esclavos, un número de esclavos, directamente a las Indias de Castilla. En esta transformación de la trata se produce una interesante evolución también a la hora de gestionar la trata de esclavos hacia América. Y es importante considerarlo porque realmente marcan un hito muy importante en la evolución entre el sistema de licencias y lo que luego vendrán a ser los asientos. Bueno, no lo he dicho, pero como pueden ver en la diapositiva, tengo que decirlo, este proyecto se enmarca en un proyecto de I+D que dirige el profesor Rafael Pérez García y yo mismo, y otro proyecto también europeo con Caribe, que dirige la profesora Chelo Naranjo en Madrid. Bueno, yo de lo que voy a hablar aquí sobre todo es sobre mercaderes. Hablaré también de esclavos y de mercancías, pero sobre todo de mercaderes. Y lo que podemos ver es una evolución interesante a la hora de establecer la forma de penetración de los mercaderes de Lisboa en los contratos. En realidad, si nos vamos a un periodo anterior, si nos vamos a los años 20, 30, muchas veces los contratadores son incluso de origen castellano. Los famosos hermanos Torres, que estudió María Manuel Torrán, que vienen de Málaga y de Sevilla, donde tienen también un hermano que es factor. Incluso burgaleses como Juan Fernández de Castro, que estudia también mi compañero Rafael Pérez. Pero yo me voy a situar a partir de los años 50 y marcar una evolución en 3 pasos. En un primer paso tendríamos el asiento, así se llama, esos pequeños contratos también se llaman asientos muchas veces, de 2.000 esclavos que firma Felipe II, de príncipe a rey, las abdicaciones de Bruselas con Manuel Caldeire. Son 2.000 esclavos para suplir la demanda de las Indias españolas o las Indias occidentales o de Castilla, como sea, entre el 56 y el 60. En este asiento, los factores de Caldeira, sus agentes, aterrizan en la mayor parte como extraterrestres en América. Llegan desde fuera, se insertan desde los barcos o a través de otras vías y luego poco a poco se van haciendo con la situación, sobre todo en el espacio del Caribe, ahora lo veremos. Pero llegan de fuera, entre comillas, ¿no? Otros agentes de Caldeira, sin embargo, ya están operando, gracias a su papel también como prestamista de la corona castellana, desde dentro, desde Cádiz, desde Medina del Campo. Son mercaderes castellanos, algunos son burgaleses, otros son de Medina del Campo, y finalmente también tenemos algunos agentes italianos jugando también al juego de las finanzas. Después hay una segunda fase en la que los contratadores van haciéndose, también muchas veces, en muchos casos, los Caldeira y sus asociados, Francisco Núñez de Beche, Pedro de Noroñez, van haciéndose con el mercado de licencias, pero no de una forma directa como en el asiento que hemos visto aquí, sino de una forma indirecta, a través de agentes. Agentes que ya no son extraterrestres, ya son, se han, digamos, quitado el casco, la escafandra, ya viven en el ambiente económico castellano, sea sevillano, de la meseta o americano, con naturalidad y se mueven con mucha más facilidad. Han pasado ya unos años, estamos en los 60, estamos en los 70 sobre todo. Ahí ha evolucionado la cuestión. Y finalmente el último paso que yo quería mencionar aquí y que ahora veremos es ese tercer paso en el cual ya el nombre de los contratadores se convierte no en una ficción, porque no lo era, pero detrás de los contratadores empieza a haber grandes grupos económicos muy complejos, muy grandes y que tienen sus raíces en otros puntos económicos. Sobre todo me estoy refiriendo al comercio con la India, pero no solo. Entonces aquí los nombres de los contratadores quedan un tanto desdibujados. Ahora veremos algún caso. Esto es muy sensible. Sí, sí. Blackboard. Como se llama en inglés, es guay. Bueno, en este mapa pedestre, yo me caracterizo siempre en mis presentaciones por hacer mapas horribles y este es uno más de ellos, ¿no? Bueno, pues aquí lo que tienen ustedes, bueno, es cómo llegan esas 2.000 licencias del asiento y la redistribución simplemente de agentes, una gran cantidad de agentes en el espacio de Caribe, ¿no? Esto, bueno, es más estudiado en otro sitio que todavía no se publicó. Y es bastante importante porque, como digo rápidamente, se hacen con el negocio muy deprisa. Hay algunos de estos agentes que además, cuando desembarca, esto lo digo al hilo de la conferencia de David de ayer, luego veremos algún ejemplo, desembarca con una carta de libertad porque es negro y va a factorizar los esclavos. Y claro, lleva la carta diciendo, cuidado, que yo soy libre y además voy a factorizar los esclavos, ¿no? Y bueno, le dejan claro qué van a hacer. Bueno, para que vean ustedes un poco la influencia de este primer asiento, ahí tienen ustedes la evolución del número de esclavos que se envíen. Fíjense ustedes, en el año 1556, del total de esclavos que se envían, Caldeira envía el 36%. Aquí hay un esfuerzo financiero enorme, financiero, logístico, etcétera, ¿no?, que Caldeira puede mantener. Y estamos en unas fechas muy tempranas. Recuerden que para los contratos posteriores de los años 80, de Cabo Verde se supone que salen 3.000 esclavos y de Angola, bueno, una cantidad variable, depende del contrato, pero también cerca de 3.000. Aquí estamos hablando de 2.000, del año 56, y como pueden ver, bueno, pues Caldeira hace un esfuerzo sostenido para liquidar todos sus compromisos con la corona de una forma eficaz, rápida y que genera, claro, una invasión de esclavos, de factores y de mercancías extrañas, ahora las veremos, y retornos muy rápida. Esto es muy rápido, es una cascada, ¿no? La monarquía abre la puerta, necesita a los esclavos. Y esto genera testimonios como este, ¿no? En esta ciudad de Santo Domingo le han venido a este tiempo hartos navíos de negros que siempre, además de los esclavos que traían con licencia, traían los capitanes, maestres y pilotos y marineros muchas menudencias de jarros, esteras, aceite y vinagre, algunos lienzos de todas suertes y especiería, claro, y otras cosas de la India, de Portugal, que todo ello hacía a la tierra gran beneficio, porque traían conservas y mermeladas y otras cosas que aprovechaban para muchos enfermos, pobrecitos. Todo era en poca cantidad, no hay ningún problema. Y además de estos navíos, han venido otros sin licencia del rey que han descargado de la costa del Brasil. Y han sido otra parte, con acuerdo del señor presidente de Santo Domingo, le hemos dejado que lo vendan todo porque lo queremos todo, ¿no? O sea, aquí ya tenemos una conexión con Brasil temprana, luego veremos una tardía, y la conexión con la India de Portugal. Más abajo, ¿qué traen? Piezas de chaff, que son unos lienzos pintados de colorado y de canecut, 15 paños de manos de canecut, piezas de chantar como sinabafas, piezas de bengalas, camisas de lienzo de canecut, bengalas, porcelanas, etc., ¿no? Una de las reflexiones finales, como no me va a dar tiempo de explicar nada, la digo ya, es que cuando estamos hablando de la trata, en realidad también estamos hablando de muchísimas más mercancías. Y muchas veces los beneficios no son solamente tantos esclavos por el barco, el outfitting, luego me los traigo, que es un cálculo muy difícil de hacer, se puede intentar llegar a algo, pero es que además tú lo que estás haciendo con la trata, lo adelanto ya, estás abriendo un espacio económico para ti. Entonces, en torno a los esclavos, y esto claro, luego sí, que lo sabemos con los holandeses, con los ingleses, pues ya lo están haciendo los portugueses, ahora ya. No hace falta esperar al siglo XVII. Y claro, lo hacen con unas mercancías que solo ellos controlan. Y además son muy apreciadas estas mercancías de la India, pero también lozas de Portugal. Esto es otro tema interesante. La loza portuguesa y la loza sevillana tienen tanto que decirse. Bueno, zapatitos y tal. Como ustedes ven aquí, esto es solo un barco que llega de forma ilegal, además, junto con los barcos de esclavos, que eran muchos, como han podido ver en la gráfica anterior, y el textil pues se lleva la parte del león. Es decir, que tenemos que imaginarnos al regidor de Santo Domingo hablando en portuñol con el portugués que le vende el esclavo mientras le está comprando una sinabafa para su señora. Para quien sea. En este asiento, que costó 18.000 ducados, consiguió documentar un mínimo vuelta. A esto hay que sumarle los gastos y los costes, claro, pero hay que sumarle una mínima revenue de 72.000 ducados. A eso, solo en oro y plata. A eso hay que sumarle lo que viene en azúcar de Santo Domingo. Están muy interesados en el azúcar los portugueses ya. Luego viene Brasil, pero claro, no van a tener tasados, ya no estaban Madeira, São Tomé. Muchísimo azúcar, que vale muchísimo dinero, como pueden ver ustedes ahí, y también muchos cueros, que valen menos, pero son importantes. 152.000 ducados. Aproximado, todo esto es aproximado. Y además, todo lo que es contrabando, que tienen ustedes ahí desglosado, por lo menos 200.000 ducados, pero seguramente es más. Porque hay envíos ilegales a las Azores, porque hay muchas cosas que no se registran, está explicado. Así que realmente el negocio se sale de los estrechos márgenes del contrato y de los estrechos márgenes de simplemente pensar solo en la persona esclavizada y los rendimientos, etcétera, porque el negocio es mucho más complejo y es mucho más amplio. Y en realidad lo que tú estás haciendo es abrir a través de la trata con un forceps un espacio económico y mercantil y colocarte dentro y rellenarlo con mercancías de las que tú eres el principal suministrador. Voy deprisa. Segunda fase, esto lo explico en un minuto, no, menos, en 30 segundos. Segunda fase, esta tabla ya la he puesto muchas veces, no es nada nueva. Esto lo publicamos el doctor Pérez y yo hace ya unos años sobre el almojarifajo de esclavos en los 70. En esta tabla lo que se ve son los principales cargadores. En este sentido, no son licencias, son esclavos que realmente se embarcan porque han pagado el impuesto, no es la licencia. Bueno, aquí tienen como, hay nombres que ha salido ayer también en la conferencia de David, Simón de Tobar, que es un médico, cosmógrafo, portugués, claro, y muy amigo de los Caldeira, Melchor Pacheco, Juan de Guzmán, Antonio Gómez Costa. Bueno, estos son los principales cargadores entre el 69 y el 79. Bueno, en realidad en rojo, todos los que están en rojo son los amigos de los Caldeira. Y a su vez, si no son sus amigos, son sus socios, o son en realidad a quienes los Caldeira Noroña, ¿ves?, financian. Y en realidad son los que le abren las líneas de crédito para que compren las licencias o les presten el dinero a sevillanos para que compren las licencias. Entonces nos colocamos en que directamente colocan en esos años el 35% de los esclavos efectivamente embarcados hacia América y si nos ponemos con los socios hasta casi la mitad. Es decir, que el negocio se puede teledirigir. Y esto se podría ampliar seguramente, pero no da tiempo. Vamos a poner el ejemplo de un contrato de Cabo Verde. Este es inédito. Yo creo que ya no voy a encontrar más contratos inéditos porque no hay más. Pero este es el último que he encontrado. Y se parece mucho a uno que publiqué en su momento en los negocios de la esclavitud en el año 2018. Ahí tienen los principales contratadores, esto es conocido por la historiografía, el monto total también es conocido por la historiografía, lo que la historiografía no ha podido añadir porque no tiene los contratos, que lo comentaba yo con Miguel Geraldez ayer sobre la cuestión de Angola, era que además había que sumarle dinero que se pagaba para obras pías, y no era una cantidad despreciable, aparte de arrobas de cera para conventos y cofradías, bueno, eso es una cosa muy testimonial, un esclavito para alguien, pero básicamente este es el monto total, ¿no? Bueno, lo que me interesa son las cuentas de abajo, ¿no? Que se ven fatal, pero yo las leo. Bueno, son 16 millones y medio de rey, que son 99.000 ducados, 99 millones de maravedíes. Bueno, para obras pías 300.000 rey, 100.000 reyes en los últimos años se tienen que dar para otras obras pías. Total, 101 millones de rey en total. Al año, 89 millones de maravedíes, en ducados 228.000, 38.000 ducados al año, ¿vale? Para entendernos. Ahora hay que tener una cosa en consideración. Este cálculo es malo, o sea, se puede mejorar, o sea, el de abajo. Más o menos la media de venta del esclavo está en 250 pesos, más o menos. Los hay de 300, los hay de 400, los hay de 120, depende. Si multiplicamos, hacemos un cálculo vasto, 250 pesos, los ducados que son, por los 3.000 esclavos, nos alcanza 300.000. Y esto solo por venta media de esclavos. Aquí hay que meter muchos más rendimientos que no están. Y los gastos, claro, lógicamente. Pero es para hacernos una idea de los cálculos de rentabilidad en los que podemos estar. Para llegar a mandar los 3.000 esclavos, los contratadores se tuvieron que matar literalmente con la contratación, porque no les dejaba mandar los esclavos. Esto lo cuenta Sell, también lo cuenta muy bien Manuel FERNÁNDEZ CHAVES, que lo tienen aquí. Y además tuvieron que ponerse de acuerdo con los Caldeira, porque ellos querían el contrato para sí, lo tendrán el siguiente. lo consiguen, ¿no? Después de un tiempo. Esto es para que se entretengan, ¿eh? El Museo de Azulejos de Lisboa, y aquí está la Rua Boa Vista, que es donde bueno, vivía Simón Ferreira de Malaca, que es el principal contratador, ¿no? Bueno, él y muchos más, ¿no? En las Pedras Negras o en Boa Vista. Bueno, esto es más o menos el alcance del contrato. Yo les iba a leer algo de lo que contemplaba el contrato, no me da tiempo. Aquí está marcado, esto sí lo digo porque creo que es pertinente para la conferencia, el río 1, y aquí, esto sí se incluía en el contrato, se cogía una hierba, la herba fotinde, y con esa hierba se teñían paños. Entonces ellos la reexportan la hierba por los ríos de Guinea y también se la llevan por aquí a Cabo Verde, que ellos también hacen sus paños. Y recolocan paños, la panería, por la zona, con lo cual otra mercancía más y una tintura que para ellos sí es importante para seguir con sus tráficos de intermediación. Y este es el mapa que sale en la Historia de Cabo Verde, donde los ríos se ven de verdad, pero ya no me da tiempo de decir nada sobre él. Bien, lo que me interesa es esto. Fíjense qué esfuerzo, un esfuerzo brutal por despachar los 3.000 esclavos. Lo consiguen. Son unos auténticos, los 4 contratadores son unos auténticos mercaderes y consiguen colocar casi 2.000 esclavos en un año. Esto es algo digno de reseñar. Luego siguen el esfuerzo y aquí, bueno, echan el último espurreo. Bueno, estos son los barcos, que no los vamos a saltar. ¿Qué pasa? Que cuando acaba el contrato hay que cobrar. Entonces lo que hacen los contratadores, y esto es muy interesante, estos contratadores que hemos visto, la mayor parte de ellos, menos Simón Ferreira de Malaca, que evidentemente también comerció con la India y estuvo en la India, se van a Sevilla. ¿Por qué Sevilla? ¿Porque es muy bonita? No, porque vienen las remesas de India. Y porque deben mucho dinero y el dinero lo van a encontrar antes en Sevilla que en Lisboa, que también tienen, porque le llega de contrabando, pero no tienen el suficiente. Bueno, su agente es Leonel de Cuadros, de que ahora estoy escribiendo un trabajito, que su agente recibe el dinerito y le da órdenes a Manuel López Quirós, que está en los ríos de Guinea, y Bras Ferreira, que Bras Ferreira era en realidad... Se habla mucho de los gramajos, pero para mí Bras Ferreira era realmente el eje de todo, porque es más antiguo además que los gramajos, y en realidad tiene la confianza de agentes que en realidad están enfrentados entre sí, pero eso es para otra película. En Lisboa se queda Simón Ferreira de Malac y tenemos a Antonio, a Ambrosio y a Diogo, que se van a Sevilla, y Antonio representa a Simón. Voy deprisa. Pedro es un verso suelto, porque Pedro en realidad tiene muchas relaciones con un Simón Freire de Lima, que en realidad son parientes, y muchas relaciones con los Caldeiras. Pedro en realidad es una especie de agente infiltrado en el contrato de los Caldeiras. Podría abundar sobre esto, pero en 20 minutos no puedo. Entonces, en Sevilla, ¿qué empezamos a descubrir? Que los contratadores no tienen ni un ducado. Sí, tienen, pero imaginariamente, lo tienen que recibir. Y mientras tanto deben mucho dinero. O sea, ellos son los dueños del contrato, sí, pero hasta un punto. Hasta el punto en el que yo soy dueño de mi casa, pero el banco es verdaderamente su dueño. Pues esto es algo muy parecido. Lanzarote de Sierra, que es también un viejo conocido con su hermano Antonio, Lanzarote de Sierra y Antonio, se encarga de cobrar las deudas de los contratadores que están aquí, de todos estos señores y de muchos más que ahora veremos, ¿no? Son deudas pequeñas, cada 13.000 ducados, 9.000 ducados, 12.000 ducados. Pero es que cuando te encuentras que que Diogo Henriques resulta que dice: yo invertí en el contrato, ¿se acuerdan de lo que valía? 30 y tantos mil al año. Yo invertí en el contrato 16.000 o 17.000 ducados, pero en realidad el 73% me lo ha prestado Afonso Bocar. Entonces, ¿usted qué dinero puso? Va a ser que el contrato es de un tal Bocarro que el contrato no aparece, ¿no? Claro, entonces Diogo necesita dinerito, porque no tiene dinero, claro. Por eso viene a Sevilla, a ver si le dan dinero. Una ciudad rica, llena de plata. Entonces, tenemos testimonios como este. Yo, Diego Enríquez, contratador que fui en el 95, cuando estaba en Sevilla, de Cabo Verde y Guinea, vecino de Lisboa, estante en Sevilla, otro que doy todo mi poder a Jorge Enríquez, hombre pardo, mi hijo. Y otra vez nos vamos a la ponencia de David de ayer. Residente en los ríos de Guinea, que sigue allí, para que por mí pueda pedir y demandar todo lo que me deben, todas las haciendas y esclavos, etcétera, por una memoria que yo dejé en Guinea a Matías Fernández, mi primo socio, ¿no? Parceiro, que cobrase de todas las personas que me lo debían y pueda cobrar. Atención, esto parecen nimiedades, pero no lo son, porque me deben 3 esclavos que me los tienen que dar. 3 piezas de esclavos, dice Pascual de Segura, que vive allí en los ríos, y 2 piezas de esclavos que me debe un piloto, Esteban Pérez, que además, volvemos a David, hombre pardo. ¿No? Bueno, nada más y nada menos. ¿Qué va a pasar? Ambrosio de Ataide y Diego Enríquez, que están en Sevilla, le dan un poder a Pedro de Salamanca para que cobre por ellos los beneficios. ¿Por qué? Pues porque van a acabar dando con sus huesos en la cárcel. Los poderosos contratadores, ¿han visto lo que envían, no? Pues en la cárcel están. Y entonces dan ese poder y que cobre y se pague a Diego Enríquez León, que es otro agente de sus acreedores, es todos 4.950 ducados que deben, ¿no? Porque nosotros estamos presos en la cárcel de la Audiencia de esta ciudad. Y que por favor que lo primero que llegue, que le paguen el dinero, porque si no es que no pueden salir de la cárcel. O sea que así están los contratadores. Utilizan por cierto una gente que no es portugués. Eso es interesante, pero no me va a dar tiempo a nada. En este cuadro en el que no ven nada, lo tenía que haber hecho más grande, pero ya no me da tiempo. Bueno, pero lo importante es que se ve un poco el lote variado de deudas que hay aquí. La mayor parte de estas deudas, diría que el 90% de lo que hay, el 95%, son a través de letras de cambio que se giran entre Lisboa y Sevilla. María Manuel Torrão, a la que ustedes ya pueden notar que aprecio bastante, hizo ya, en la historia general de Cabo Verde, hizo ya un diagrama muy bueno del circuito de letras de cambio de plata entre Sevilla, Cabo Verde, América y Lisboa. Pero hay otro circuito, que es el de Sevilla-Lisboa, en el que luego todo esto se negocia y se renegocia. Entonces, si se fijan a la derecha, donde no leo ni yo, los que acreedores, no los creditors, son Wilfred Pereira, que va a ser el agente de Reinel y va a hacer más cosas, Jorge Rodríguez Solís, que va a ser, luego va a estar detrás de los Coutinho, pero es que además Jorge Rodríguez Solís, lo voy a decir en español, para ir rápido, en realidad es el gran arquitecto de la petición, el intento de petición de perdón a Felipe III al comienzo del siglo XVII, nada menos. Y además es un gran mercader con la India, entre otras cosas. Ya salió la India. Y luego los Vas Débora, los Gómez, que también tienen muchas relaciones, sobre todo con Flandes, otra conexión fundamental. Y eso, y los Bocarro, de los Bocarro podía haber dado una ponencia nada más, pero que no tenía sentido, esto es más interesante, son los dueños del contrato. 107.000 ducados. Esto es una parte de sus deudas, deben más. Por eso van a la cárcel. Están, bueno, como Enslaved, etcétera, ¿no? Y ahí las distintas cantidades, no me enrollo. Todo esto es del 94 al 95, a través, la mayor parte, repito, de letras de cambio, que se giran. Es Simón Ferreira de Malacar, que está en Lisboa un poco capeando el temporal. Pero ellos también ingresan, por lo menos, y esto es solamente una aproximación, porque esto sí que nunca me da lugar a determinarlo, al menos de estos años y este pequeño golpecito de aquí, 77.000 ducados. De hecho, de una vez te pueden entrar 32.000 ducados. No está mal, pero esto no voy a abundar en ello. ¿Cómo voy? Perfecto. Esto es un cuadro muy bonito en el cual lo que se ve es lo que gastan y lo que no gastan en cobrar. Como no me da tiempo, pues no lo explico. Y no, la culpa es mía por hacer un PowerPoint tan largo. Bueno, y esto es lo mismo, pero escrito, que les acabo de explicar. ¿Qué pasa? Aquí está Bocarro, ¿lo ven? Este es su hermano. Está en Sevilla y en Lisboa. Que en realidad el dinero que va a entrar enviado desde América de los contratadores, luego como se gira en letras de cambio a los que ya les han prestado el dinero para enviar 1.890 y tantos esclavos en un año, habían pedido mucho dinero. Claro, que no es músculo financiero propio, en realidad el que va al gimnasio es el otro. Entonces, claro, ¿qué hace con este dinero los bocarros? Lo invierten en Angola y de Angola envían los esclavos un par de años después con todo lo que han ganado prestándole dinero y financiando el contrato de Cabo Verde. Es buenísimo, porque además los bocarros son amiguitos de Sevilla y del Amego, que son los contratadores que acaban en el 94, y luego, bueno, se llevan medio bien con Joan Escogei. Bueno, es un ejemplo muy tonto, se podría explicar mucho mejor, pero al menos que se vea esta relación. Es decir, están invirtiendo en un contrato para sacar el rendimiento y además con la letra, los intereses, y luego pues sacar más. En medio queda el factor de los contratadores, que es Duarte da Costa, que hace, bueno, vende licencia, como decía ayer en inglés, que yo no sabía decir eso en inglés, David, ¿no? Matches matches a todo el mundo para que invierta, haga pequeñas inversiones en las armazones, el outfitting lo animan, ¿no? Lo hacía Simón de Tobar, lo hace Duarte de Acosta. Duarte de Acosta es nada más y nada menos, esto me lo salto, ¿vale? Bueno, va a ser, y esto lo expliqué la semana pasada en un congreso, lo que voy a decir ahora, o sea que no es nuevo, el nuevo de la semana pasada. Además, él trabaja va a trabajar después para los Caldeiras y va a ser el arrendador, el cobrador de las aduanas de Portugal. Cerramos el negocio por otro lado. Y ahora vemos por qué. Porque invierte en azúcar. ¿Se acuerdan del azúcar al principio? Volvemos al azúcar. ¿El azúcar del Caribe? Sí, me gusta. ¿El azúcar de Brasil? Ahora también. Y ampliamos el negocio. Entonces, en esta gráfica incomprensible que he puesto varias veces, aquí están los socios de Duarte de Acosta, representa a los Caldeiras, hace cobranzas para los contratadores también de antes, está casado con la hermana de Simón de Tobar, que salía ayer, claro, es el heredero natural, y además hace armazones de esclavos en nombre de los contratadores, luego los Caldeiras, comercia con Nueva España y crea compañías de comercio, compañías pequeñas, para comerciar con Brasil. Y traerse, es que esto es muy complicado, y traerse el azúcar de Brasil. Se lo puede traer directamente, hay viajes directos, Sevilla, Cádiz, Lisboa, Brasil. ¿Hay? ¿Muchos? Bueno, muchos, los que tiene que haber. De Lisboa hay más, claro. O por la vía de Puerto Rico. Sí, los barcos llegan de arribada desde Brasil a Puerto Rico. Es que no me he equivocado. Y entonces en Puerto Rico cargan azúcar de Puerto Rico y azúcar de Brasil y lo venden en Sevilla a refinadores y a pasteleros. Y además, con los beneficios, arman esclavos. El tiempo se ha acabado. Entonces, conclusiones. A todas las mercancías de América les meto las mías. El Indian Indigo también. Y esto es muy complicado. Y lo que pone en inglés es que es muy complicado de analizar y que hay que analizarlo. Y ya está. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Manuel, por esa presentación muy interesante sobre la financiación de esos asientos en un periodo bastante temprano que es muy interesante analizar. I will now give the floor to Filipa Ribeiro da Silva from the International Institute of Social History. The title of her presentation is Looking for the Gainers and Gains in the Spanish Asiento Slave Trade and Spanish-American Slave-Based Production, Challenges and Possibilities.
Gracias. I will speak in English because that's easier for me, as this is my regular academic language rather than my mother tongue. And I apologize for that for those of you that are Portuguese speakers like me and Spanish speakers. I would like to start by thanking Manuel, Pedro, and Jonathan for the very kind invitation to come here today and share some thoughts with you about my research and involvement in the study of the Asiento trade. And I will start by making a first remark on the change of my title, because between the invitation and the moment of being here, I kept thinking about how to study and analyze gains and gainers in the transatlantic slave trade as a whole, and in the specific, the Iberian slave trade more specifically. And in that process, my thinking has evolved, and therefore I have decided to change the title to, especially the subtitle, to Towards a Global Approach. What I would like to do today here is basically divide my presentation in two parts. One part where I will talk you through a bit about the debate around the question of gains and gainers of the slave trade, and what I have, through my research within the Iberian slave trade, have identified as main shortcomings in this debate. And then I would like, on the second part of my presentation, basically propose a new way of looking at these discussions and highlighting on one hand the complexity of these, which has been already shown very clearly yesterday with various examples, but also this morning by Manuel. And then try to give you some examples from the Iberian context and explore ways forward and methodologies and sources, combinations that we could use for that. So moving on to the debate, as most of you in this room know, the discussion about the gains and gainers of the slave trade and of slave-based production has emerged or started with the thesis of Eric Williams in the 1940s. And basically, Williams made two arguments. On one hand, he argued that he had two questions. One question was, how did slavery contribute to the development of capitalism, and specifically how the profits of the slave trade contributed to the industrialization of Britain, leading Britain to allowing Britain to become one of the major colonial powers, but also world powers in the 19th and 20th century, thanks to industrialization. This discussion, in my view, can be divided in like 5 main moments, or the debate that follow with Williams' thesis. There's the first moment, which is, I call it the genesis. These terms can be discussed, of course, which is his thesis, properly speaking, but also the work by the Guineanese historian, Walter Rodney, that wrote a very famous book for the African side of this debate on how Europe and developed Africa. And then follow up on these works and also works of the Caribbean historians. There has been an expansion of this debate by Dubois and Barbara Solow that presented evidence that showed that, in fact, what Williams was arguing for the British case and for Britain specifically, maybe could also be argued for North America more broadly. So they gave evidence that somehow sustained Eric Williams' thesis. Of course, these had also very strong reactions from historians in Europe, but also in the United States. Among them, I have cited here Ingerman, Pete Emmer, who was my former supervisor, and Patrick O'Brien, that basically rejected this and said, well, effectively, the gains from the slave trade were very limited, and we cannot argue that this would lead to the economic development of Northern and Western Europe and the industrialization. At the same time, these discussions have started the interest of several scholars that were working mainly on African history, and also an interest in trying to measure the magnitude of the slave trade. And this is where the whole effort that today we have gathered on the slave voyages dataset emerges, with the work of first Philip Curtin, but then David Richardson, David Eltis, and many others that have contributed, some of them in this room, have led to a consolidation of this debate and the gathering of evidence that could, in fact, sustain the argument that the magnitude of slave trade was such that maybe analyzing just the profits of the slave trade itself wouldn't be sufficient to assess the impact of these phenomena and these practices in economic terms. So in the last decade, I would say, and to a great extent thanks to the revival of the discussions about the genesis of early modern capitalism since the last financial crisis, there has been a revival of these of the study of the Eric Williams thesis. And I mention here a couple of historians that have contributed to these. And I myself have written a piece that came out on slavery and abolition this year that tries, in fact, to explore how we can look at this from the perspective of the Iberian and the Portuguese-Brazilian slave trade. And it was through that exercise that I have come to realize, on one hand, two things. On one hand, I have realized how absent the Iberian slave trade is from these discussions, to a great extent because Portugal and Spain, as European colonial states, have not become wealthy, and therefore, there was no need to have this discussion. But on the other hand, I have realized that the way this subject has been approached has several shortcomings, and I would move on to that. One of the main shortcomings that I have seen is, especially in the historiography that is Anglophone, but also on the Dutch cases that are more recent and on the French case studies, is that these studies are very national-oriented. So the aim is to measure what is the profits and the impact of the gains from slave trading in national economies, and also within imperial economies. And as we all know, as historians of the Iberian slave trade, this makes no sense. It might make sense for the British and the Dutch case to a certain extent, and even then I would say only to a certain extent, but certainly not for the Iberian case. I also realize that this is to a great extent the result of what other historians for other contexts have called as methodological nationalism, which has to do with the way we have been trained in thinking from the perspective of the nation state and using the sources that have been produced by the former colonial states and the Iberian crowns and other crowns in Europe. And also, I think it has been highly influenced by the fact that the way we think of all these matters only within the context of one single empire. So we could also say that there is a sort of methodological imperialism on the way we look at these subjects, and somehow this is an obstacle in fully understanding what we are, the complexity of this. And I added to this also, there is a kind of methodological Atlanticism. This word does not exist in English, but I think it makes sense in this context because all this discussion about the slave trade is very Atlantic-centric. And as we have seen through various interventions yesterday, but also today with Manuel's intervention earlier, there's a lot of Asia input in this slave trade and in the understanding of how these business work, and therefore we need to move, I think, beyond this focus on understanding what is the gains and the gainers of slave trade and slave-based production only for Europe, and to move on to look at it, what is there for Asia to gain and what is there for the Americas to gain. So on the basis of this reflection, and this I will skip because that's not, oh, something happened here. I moved too fast, I'm sorry. No, okay. This is, something happened here. Okay, so let's move on to this. So on the basis of this reflection, I have put together this diagram, and I will try to talk you through this. So this is how I see how we should maybe look into the gains and gainers of the slave trade, by looking into clusters of gains. So on one hand, if we think of a slave voyage, we think people need insurance, people need credit, so there's gains to be had in financial terms. Then you need to outfit your ship, you need to provision in terms of, provisions in terms of trade commodities. You need to sometimes freight a ship because you don't own your own ship, so there's gains to be had there. And sometimes you don't want to freight a ship yourself, you just want a share in that ship, so you will have to pay for shipping of your commodities to engage in trade. So there's also gains for people involved or people supplying these logistics, let's put it like that. Then there's gains to be had in the trade, and most of the scholarship within the Anglophone world, but also on the Spanish Asiento, focus on these, because this is what we have most evidence, is the gains from the commerce and the gains from the administration and the taxation of this commerce, because we have the state papers, of course. And then there's the gains from the output of slave labor. And this is something that for the Anglophone world has been better studied, but less studied for the Iberian context. But here again, there's a whole array of people, merchants, entrepreneurs that are going to gain from these, because you gain from, the wholesale of raw materials, from the processing the raw materials, but also from processing the minerals that are extracted in the Americas at least in part with slave labor. And then you also gain from selling the wholesale of these processed commodities and from the retailing. And the most important thing in all of this is that this does not happen within the frame of a single nation state, within the frame of a single empire, far from it. If we look at the geography of these very quickly, so I will not run out of time, if we think, for example, on the gains from the financial services, while these are to a great extent, especially in the beginning, they would be based mainly in Europe. However, if we look at the gains from logistics, so far people have focused their attention on Europe, but has several examples presented yesterday have shown there's also outfitting of ships in Africa, there's outfitting of ships in the Americas. There's even construction of ships in America. So there's people in this business in Africa, but also in the Americas, in different locations that are profiting from this activity. And that is something that so far has not been accounted for. The other thing is there's a lot of products, as Manuel has shown earlier today, but other colleagues have shown yesterday, and we know from the literature that do not come from Europe, they do not come from the Americas, they come from Asia, which means that in Asia you also have people gaining from catering to the demands of the trade commodities that go into the slave trade. And they also will gain from the outputs of enslaved labor in the Americas indirectly, and this is something that has not been accounted for. If we move on to the gains of the commerce, most of the focus again has been in Europe and in specific nations, but as we know from the Iberian case studies, these involves multiple countries within Europe, and involves also people in Africa, as Miguel yesterday clearly demonstrated. There's people in Africa, African merchants, people of Afro-European descent, but also representatives of the European authorities that are gaining from this business, not only from slave trading, but also from provisioning ships in Angola, because there were farms that produced for the shipping, for the outfitting of the ships there. And that has not been accounted for. And the same goes for the gains from the output of slave labor, which the focus so far has been in Europe, but if we look carefully, there's people in the Americas that are also gaining from these, not only the planters, but people that will use produced slave goods to outfit ships in the Americas that go straight to Africa and that will engage in slave trading. So this is something that needs to be taken into account. The same goes for what ends up going to Asia, which is something that so far, when we think of gains and gainers of the slave trade, we don't pay attention to. So moving on to well, this is more detail of, you know, how you can, the different gainers in different places, but I have already talked about this, so the different people, so insurers, credit providers, financiers, producers of goods, ship owners, and so on. So this, I don't think we need to go into this. And now I'll give you a couple of examples from the Spanish Asiento, from different periods. So the first example I would like to give you is Jacob Belmont, also known as Diogo Nunes Belmont. He was in the business, as far as I could trace, between 1613 and 1629, and if you place his activities within this diagram, you see how complex things were. I mean, he was officially engaged in the Asiento business as someone that had a license to operate, but then his insurers were in the Netherlands. His credit comes from the southern Netherlands and from France. The provisioning of the ships and the outfitting and the freightage of ships was done in the Dutch Republic on the first hand, but then he also stopped in Portugal and in Spain because he needed to take care of the paperwork to go to Spanish America and to go to Angola. So there's also outfitting in Portugal, there's outfitting in Angola, and again there will be outfitting in the Spanish West Indies, because you cannot return back without, you know, provisions again, and without also commodities that we will bring back to Europe. So in all this process, there's people in these different locations that are gaining from this. Then we move on, and of course the crown will gain from, you know, taxation. It will gain, and the leaseholders gain from the selling of the licenses and so on. But when it comes to the trade itself, then the slave trading itself, what we are going to see that there is people in the Upper Guinea, but in Cabo Verde and in Angola that trade with Belmont and that are also making money from this business, including the African authorities on the ground that collect taxes over the activities of the trade, which is something that is very difficult to quantify, but it is a reality. Then he also makes money from the sale of produced commodities in Brazil, mainly in Brazilian sugar and in African hides, which were also produced by slave labor. The African hides were very often produced in the Cape Verde Islands with slave labor, and the Brazilian sugar was produced in Brazil with slave labor. So there's also these individuals are gaining from the work of enslaved Africans, not only in the Americas, but also in Africa, which is something that also has not been accounted for. If we look at the gains from the output of slave labor, what we see is that there's people gaining in Northern Europe because the sugar that is produced in Brazil heads to Northern Europe. But also it goes to the Mediterranean because Belmonte was involved in the redistribution of sugar across several Mediterranean ports, so far as to Constantinople. And he's also engaged in supplying hides, especially to the textile industries in the Netherlands, but also in Italy. So there's people also in this sector that are gaining from these activities. This shows, I think, in a very clear way, the complexity of this all. And I am running out of time. I had another example from the 1660s for the, with again, Italians involved in the Asiento trade in an indirect way. Francisco Ferroni was a broker in Amsterdam that acted for the Grillo e Lomellini Asiento holders and was the man that worked as a broker to allow the Coimans to start in the business before they hold the Asiento, so already in the 1660s. And as you can see from this diagram now in the map, there's a multiple places that are engaged in this, and a lot of people that are gaining from these activities, including within the British Empire and the Dutch Empire. And the same goes if we look at the extraction of gold and silver in the Spanish Americas. What we see, and this is very badly represented with arrows, I apologize for this, but it was a very rough attempt to show the circulation of these products. What we see is even though these products come to Spain, they do not stay in Spain. They will end up going to well, what would be today Germany, but what would also be the Italian cities. It goes to the Netherlands to pay the armies that are there, but it also heads to Asia in both ways, across the Cape Route, but also across the Pacific, which means that, you know, the silver that is being extracted in Spanish America within slave labor in part, and also the gold does spread across the globe, and there's people gaining from this across the globe. So I will move on from this. So this is what I think is the way forward, is beyond the national derivatives, beyond the imperial spaces, beyond the Atlantic, and beyond numbers, because I do believe it's very difficult to quantify, thank you very much, all of these, and the quantification, although it's important because it gives us a sense of the magnitude of the business, both on slave trading as well as on enslaved produced commodities, it does not capture fully the dimension and the impact of these at a global scale. So how do I think this can be done? I think this can be done by a combination of methodologies, which so far most studies tend to choose either one methodology or another, but I think we need to go for a combination of methodologies on where, on one hand, we try to trace global connections by, you know, studying business networks, not only of merchants, but also of people involved in finance and in wholesale and in retailing on one hand, and on the other hand, try to reconstruct the value chains of the goods that are produced within slave labor across not only the Americas, but also in Africa, because that would allow us to have a better sense. How this can be done, to a great extent, the scholars that study the Iberian world are already doing this to a certain extent, which is to do a combination of sources that come from different countries. But other scholars that study other empires and these phenomena in other empires are still not exploring that, which is a combination of source materials located in Europe, but also in Africa and in Asia, because those do exist. And in the Americas, as our colleagues have shown yesterday, the richness of the American archives for these purposes. And then try to do this by using a triangulation of different types of sources. On one hand, the state papers that we all use because they are at hand and they are abundant, but also private business papers that are sometimes in private archives, as you have talked about yesterday. But also use descriptive sources and qualitative sources, because even though they do not provide us the numbers again, they provide us with context and sometimes with far richer information than the numbers themselves. So as final considerations, I would just leave these two thoughts, that I think that the gains and the impact of the transatlantic slave trade are greater and broader than so far has been acknowledged by the scholarship, but also by the stakeholders and the wider audiences, I think. And on the other hand, I think numbers alone cannot capture the magnitude of these and the long-term consequences and legacies for present-day societies across the globe. Thank you very much. I look forward to your feedback.
Thank you very much. for this excellent presentation and methodological proposal about the gains of the slave trade. And I'm sure we'll have many questions on that in the discussion. We'll now move on, and I will give the floor to Paula Vargas Arana. She's a British Academy Newton Fellow at King's College, and the title of her presentation is Procesos judiciales para aprobar la legalidad de las personas africanas ingresadas a las minas de Antioquía, Nuevo de Reino de Granada, 1587-1634, fuentes para entender los tentáculos de las licencias y el asiento interior del comercio americano.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the organizers. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Jonathan, for the receptive answers that you had to me since the beginning that I was interested in participating. It was too late, so I had, as you said at the beginning, 2 days to prepare this presentation. And so thanks so much for allowing me to share this. So I'm going to start in English, and then I'm going to move to Spanish because we're going to analyze a source that I'm working currently in my research. So just to begin, this is not working. Okay, so since 1587, as part of the local laws called ordenanzas created for the mines of Antioquia in the inner New Kingdom of Granada, legal proceedings were carried out where the slave owners had to prove the legal origin of the payment of taxes by the enslaved they held. Consequently, the slaveholders had to build a package of documents that included the purchase records called fees, and that's the way it's written in the documents, fees with double E. It were the ports in which they had acquired these people appear, such as Concepción de Veragua, Cartagena de Indias, Santa Marta, sometimes Rio de la Hacha. In addition, they describe how the sale had been carried out, detailing the names and the surnames assigned to the acquired African peoples, which allow us to trace their origins. This is a huge debate, as you all know, that the surnames that were assigned to the people may relate to the ports of origin or either to the ethnonyms that people had in that period, or also to a name that the slave traders put to the regional situation of that people living there. So it's a huge debate. We can enter later on this. But also we have then the information in the phase of who were, I'm reading, I cannot sign, who were the buyers and the sellers, the name of the vessel captain, the holder of the license or of the asiento in which they were part, the date of arrival in America, and the regions of origins of the vessel, whether they were from Guinea, Angola, Cabo Verde, or the Canary Island, and even include the name of the person who he had transported them to the mines of Antioquia. In this presentation, I will analyze in detail one of the processes available in the General Archive of the Nation, Archivo General de la Nación de Colombia in Bogotá. I'm working specifically with the same fondo that Alex Borucki spoke yesterday, so it's very interesting because it's a link to his talk yesterday. Okay, so between the years of 1587 and 1634, when the gold mines of Antioquia had their greatest boom. Such processes are rich source of information that allow us to deepen our understanding of licenses and the settlement, and also of the asiento, whose tentacles and networks of traffickers were not limited to the landing ports, but that the roots in the interior of colonies such as the New Kingdom of Granada, wherever African people were introduced. So wherever you have introduced African population, you have the tentacles of the license and the asientos. And in this case, it's very interesting to notice that as the gold was so much in Antioquia, as I'm going to explain, so these traffickers moved from Cartagena or even from Santo Domingo and the Caribbean and go to live to Antioquia. They went to live to Antioquia or to Santa Fe, Bogota, and so the links of the traffickers were like expanding all the time because of the interest in being like directly linked with the gold. And more importantly, these documents brings us closer to the life trajectories of these African people up to the Antioquia mines, giving a glimpse of their origins and allowing a greater understanding of the formation of the African diaspora in the region of New Kingdom of Granada. And with this, I want to advance that the focus of my research is this, is the African population. So I think that it's also like in dialogue with what Filipa has just presented, because I'm working and I'm going to talk about the losers. And I think that we cannot understand the asiento and the licencias without understanding, and all the whole project of capitalism that was arose in that period, without thinking in this amount of population that was losing their cultures, that was losing their territories, that were captured in that period and transported to America. So. And I believe that, and my approach is that they are not losers in cultural or even in identity terms, but they are losers only in economic terms, in the sense that they were completely impoverished in that period, but the richness of their culture was expressed evidently in the Americas, and whenever they were into, so they were responsive to that oppression, and then instead of losers, they became greater influencers and also impacted and contributed to the construction of the Americas. Okay, so let's briefly talk about the context of Antioquia. I'm going to move to Spanish if it's okay with everybody. Bueno, vamos entonces a hablar entonces un poco del contexto de las minas. Voy a hablar lentamente para los que su lengua materna no es el español. Entonces tenemos aquí un mapa de Colombia, uno de los países más bellos y ricos en recursos del mundo. Y entonces tenemos el puerto de Cartagena, que lo señalé allí. Abajo del puerto de Cartagena hay una grandísima área que es inundable, y esa área inundable era muy difícil de transitar dentro de los métodos inventados por los europeos, porque pues, son grandes pantanos, no pasan caballos, no hay forma de construir caminos y no había forma de llegar a las montañas. Con mucha dificultad llegan a las primeras estribaciones de la cordillera, donde aparece el círculo rojo, y allí están ubicadas las minas. Es importante decir que estas minas, vamos a ver si me pasa así. Es importante decir que estas minas, en las que estaban en el círculo rojo, ya estaban siendo explotadas, ¿no? Y producidas por una gran civilización, una civilización milenaria y enorme que existía en la región, que era la civilización Zenú. Y cuando llega específicamente Pedro de Heredia, ya lo veremos en el siguiente slide, bueno, va a encontrar toda una magnitud enorme de piezas como la que allí está. Esta era entonces, se había desarrollado sobre esas sabanas húmedas con una red hidráulica muy grande, tarde, que está pues datada desde el 2000 antes de Cristo, entonces es muy antigua. Aquí vemos entonces en las dos imágenes los canales y los caminos que había sido construido en esta sociedad, y en ese momento no se sabe mucho de la historia antes, pero en ese momento gobernaba una mujer, las mujeres gobernaban en ese periodo la civilización zenú. Cuando inmediatamente llegan los ocupadores españoles, pues van a destruir completamente esta civilización. Sin embargo, los sobrevivientes huyen para áreas más montañosas, se refugian y está viva todavía tanto su lengua como su cultura. Entonces ya para que entremos en esta cuestión de los asientos y de las licencias, que es más de lo que voy a hablar hoy por el tiempo que tuve para prepararlo, porque estoy publicando un artículo acerca de esto, de este caso que voy a presentar. Entonces, esto es más temprano, creo que lo que hemos hablado. En 1532, Pedro de Heredia llega entonces allá a la región donde va a fundar Cartagena, y llega ya inmediatamente autorizado con una licencia para entrar a 300 personas y después 100 más. Entonces ya solamente este sujeto ya tuvo licencia para 400 personas. Eso estuvo directamente relacionado con una carta donde hablaba de las riquezas del zenú, de todas estas piezas de oro que estaba encontrando, y empieza inmediatamente con estas 400 personas una expedición. Es para lo que en términos del Congreso es interesante que él tiene asociación con inversores de Sevilla y de Santo Domingo, ¿cierto? Entonces eso es una red enorme que llega hasta las Canarias. De hecho él mismo paró en las Canarias, y la licencia que pide también es interesante porque de las Canarias es que él dice que tiene estas 300 personas ya capturadas y listas para el envío desde las Canarias. Entonces ya él estaba también vinculado con esas redes del tráfico que, como hablaba con el profesor Almeida ayer, está muy asociado, veo yo, con Cardim, y es un asunto que todavía está por estudiarse. Bien. Entonces ahora sí entremos ya sabiendo más o menos el contexto. Llega Pedro Heredia, bueno, un poco para hablar más de Pedro Heredia. Con estas 300 personas se logra saquear completamente todas las tumbas y las piezas que estaban en los altares rituales, y posteriormente dice, bueno, pero estas piezas ya están hechas, ¿dónde están los yacimientos? Y fue un hombre muy sanguinario, y a través de la tortura, y también fue juzgado por dos veces aquí en España, porque hizo una violación masiva también de mujeres indígenas, y a través de esos métodos logra llegar a las fuentes que están en aquel circulito que les mostré, que es la región que posteriormente se va a denominar Antioquia. Y en Antioquia, entonces, inmediatamente después de que se encuentran estas minas, va a impulsarse ya la introducción de personas africanas, a punto que entre 1580 y 1600 se calcula que 3000 personas africanas ingresarían a la región de Antioquia. Entonces, por ese motivo, en 1587 se hacen estas ordenanzas para organizar un poco y controlar a esa cantidad de personas que estaban entrando. Entonces, ustedes se pueden imaginar el volumen de contrabando que había. Y debido a ese volumen de contrabando, entonces se le va a pedir a todos los que en ese momento eran dueños de esclavizados que presenten estas fes probando el origen. Y que, como digo, son documentos riquísimos. Vamos a pasar entonces a analizar este documento. Esto está, repito, es lo que en el mismo fondo que está estudiando Alex Boruque actualmente, que se llama Negros y Esclavos. Este es del año de 1589, Antioquia. Gonzalo Ortiz, vecino de Zaragoza, un juicio que se le siguió por contrabando de negros. Si entonces vemos aquí Entonces, voy a leer rápidamente esta primera parte solo para contextualizar y verla. En la ciudad de Zaragoza de Antioquia, a 10 días del mes de noviembre de 1589 años, ante el capitán Rodrigo Pardo, factor de la Hacienda Real en el Nuevo Reino de Granada, juez de comisión de la Gobernación de Antioquia, por el señor doctor Antonio González del Consejo Real de Indias, del Rey Nuestro Señor, y ante mí el presente escribano pareció presente Gonzalo Ortiz, por sí, en nombre de Isabel Ortiz, su madre, y dijo, en cumplimiento del auto proveído por el dicho juez de comisión, que le había sido notificado sobre la constante a 10 negros, viene a ser la declaración que le está mandada, la cual hace en esta manera. En esta dicha su madre tiene los negros siguientes: Simón Sape, Francisco Biafra, Pedro Brand, Domingo Biafra, Pedro Cacheo, Pedro Biafra, Juan Biafra, Felipa Biafra, María Biafra, Ana Angola. Entonces, en esta primera parte vemos ya, en primer lugar, los nombres y apellidos de una lista de personas africanas, asunto que es pues bastante difícil de encontrar realmente en las fuentes, y que tenemos aquí un volumen documental inexplorado en este fondo que trae esta serie de documentación. Vemos entonces también el pedido que se le hace a Ortiz de que demuestre el origen de estas personas, por las cuales dijo que unas piezas van declaradas, dijo tener a su cargo en nombre de la dicha su madre, y que en esta ciudad y jurisdicción declara que su madre no tiene otra ninguna pieza de esclavos, y lo juró en forma de derecho, Bien, entonces aquí vamos a entrar a ver cómo procedió a hacer la declaración de estas personas. Yo no sé, yo había subrayado sí, ¿sabes que no me está apareciendo los subrayados en amarillo, que era lo que iba a leer? No aparece, bueno. Listo. Ya. Bueno, listo, entonces… Bueno, aquí en esta parte quiero destacar entonces que esto se hizo a 6 años, entonces esto se emitió a 6 años atrás de la llegada. En 1587 se dijo en las ordenanzas, los que llegaron desde hace 6 años, entonces desde 1581 tenía que demostrarse ese proceso. Bien. Entonces, en esta parte, ¿no será que se puede? Ya no hay forma, ¿verdad? No. Es que tenía subrayado en amarillo lo que quería leer, pero bueno, no importa. Listo, entonces, lo primero entonces que va a mostrar es, y aquí tampoco hay forma de señalar, sí, creo que sí. Espera, un momento, dibujo, pincel. Ok. Bueno, entonces va a comenzar el proceso por probar sobre Francisco Biafra, Pedro Brand, Juan Cacheo Brand y Felipa Brand. ¿Sí? Entonces dice que estas 4 personas las entró antes de 1581, entonces que no debería probarlas, ¿sí? Que estas quedarían ya que ya deberían ser aceptadas, y que al final va a hacer un interrogatorio con testigos demostrando que efectivamente tiene estas personas hace más de los 6 años que se pide. Bien, después entonces vamos a, sigue esa frase del otro, vamos a la una firmada de Francisco Cuellar, entonces vamos a mostrar las fes que colocó a disposición entonces del juez, que son la una firmada por Francisco Cuellar, contador de aquella sazón de la Concepción de Veragua, en que consta ser libre de derecho Simón Sape, Ana Brand, asimismo vinieron de la Concepción de Veragua a 7 años, con el dicho Alonso Esteban Ortiz, mi padre, y de otra firmada de Francisco González de Castro, contador de Santa Marta, en que consta ser libre de los derechos la dicha Ana de la Tierra Angola. Entonces, de estas personas va a mostrar, como digo, todo el barco, vamos a continuar para ver cómo muestra esta información. Bien, bueno, voy a seguir, es que sin el subrayado queda un poco difícil. Bien, esta es la primera entonces que coloca. Entonces va a llamar a este sujeto Antonio Alonso de Tapia. Bueno, llamar la atención también en el anterior, que ya nos habla de Cuéllar. Cuéllar en realidad era un funcionario que estaba en Cartagena, él pues obviamente estaba vinculado con la recepción de africanos, y después él se descubrió en estos documentos que él se muda para Antioquia, es uno de los que se muda, entonces hace, digamos que jalona todo el tráfico hacia adentro del continente, ya a donde están las minas. Luego este sujeto, Alonso de Tapia, ya es el contador de Cartagena, quien va a firmar esta fe, ¿sí? Y va a decir entonces, va a declarar que son libres de derechos de su majestad, pertenecientes por cuanto vinieron registrados de los reinos de España en el navío nombrado San Pedro, mestre Alonso Pavón, que vino de los ríos de Guinea y entró al puerto de esta ciudad en 10 de abril de este año, los cuales vinieron en cuenta de la licencia de 2.400 esclavos que su majestad hizo merced a Justo Espinosa por su cédula en Madrid a 13 de enero de 1562 años, y para ello consta de pedimiento del dicho Gonzalo Fernández di la presente fe en Cartagena a 2 de junio de 1585 años. Bueno, entonces ya ustedes ven pues la magnitud de información que solo este folio ya nos puede brindar, esto también para invitarlos, ¿verdad?, a explorar esta serie de archivos americanos que ahora están todos online, y cuánto nos pueden hablar de hasta dónde entonces tuvo penetración e impacto este funesto episodio de la historia de la humanidad, que fue el tráfico de esclavizados africanos. Y que entonces vemos que nos da también ya el nombre de la persona que llevaba esta licencia, que se puede, pues, por supuesto, buscar aquí en Indias. Yo no lo voy a hacer porque yo me dedico a los africanos y las africanas, entonces es una invitación también, me parece un tema bastante interesante, y el número también de personas que tenía entonces esta licencia, los años específicos y sobre todo el trayecto, ¿verdad? Entonces nos dice específicamente que venía ya de los ríos de Guinea. Asimismo vamos a ver la otra licencia, que es de la mujer angolana, que nos va a especificar entonces ya su origen también. Vamos a ver cuál es esta. Sí, bueno, esta entonces también es bastante interesante. Esta entonces es una que entra a la provincia de Santa Marta, entonces ya también vemos la diversidad de puertos, vemos unos que llegaban por Cartagena, por Concepción de Veragua, y en este caso que fue una minoría, y aquí es interesante destacar entonces que tenemos esa fuente de Santa Marta, que viene Ana de tierra Angola, de Martín de Astienza, entonces también tenemos el nombre del esclavista, es libre de todos los derechos al rey nuestro señor pertenecientes por cuanto vino en navío nombrado San Antonio de la Cruz, maestro y capitán Íñigo Lobo de Acosta, que subió al puerto de esta ciudad en 4 días del mes de marzo de 1589, con licencia y registro del presidente juez oficiales de la Casa de Contratación de Sevilla y por el juez de registros de la villa de Tenerife de la isla de Canaria, que vino por la vía del reino de Angola, debajo y cuenta de la licencia de 176 esclavizados, esclavos porque es el documento, de que su majestad hizo merced a Domingo Vélez por su cédula en San Mateos el 10 de enero del año pasado de 86, y la dicha cédula no ha de pasar al nombre de Dios porque lo manda su majestad por la dicha cédula y porque de ello conste y a pedimiento del dicho di la presente fe en Santa Marta 16 de marzo de 1589. Bueno, creo que sobra aquí analizar pues la riqueza de toda esta envergadura de la red que varios han explicado aquí, y que aquí tenemos pues contenido en un único folio. También interesante entonces ver esa ruta que de Angola, esta mujer salió de Angola fue hasta las Canarias, estuvo en las Canarias, pasó en las Canarias un tiempo y después sí se dirigió a Santa Marta, un puerto que para ese momento ya estaba en decadencia por el motivo de la fuerza de las resistencias indígenas y también por las sublevaciones de las personas africanas. Para terminar, entonces, esta es una tabla que realicé para mi tesis doctoral, que contiene entonces todos los casos que encontré de este tipo de documentos con los nombres etnónimos, ¿verdad?, que aparecen en los apellidos de estas personas. Es interesante, entonces encontré 267 personas. Es interesante que la mayoría, y eso es algo que David ya, afortunadamente ya levantó para el caso de Cartagena y nos brindó, digamos, con toda esta información de que efectivamente para el periodo la mayoría habrían venido entonces de la Alta Guinea y Senegambia para la Nueva Granada. Y luego en segundo lugar están las personas de África Central, ¿sí?, en volumen y magnitud, y todos estos apellidos que tenemos aquí nos hablan de la envergadura de la diversidad, tanto lingüística como cultural, y de los aportes todos que vinieron posteriormente a construir esa nación bellísima que se llama Colombia hoy, y que recibió entonces de todas estas personas pues su gastronomía, sus formas de hacer política, sus resistencias políticas y sociales, también sus aportes musicales, sus aportes rituales, en fin. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por su presentación y de nuevo por haberla presentado en tan poco tiempo y por haber enseñado esos documentos, ¿no?, tan ricos, y este control también sobre la licencia a nivel local. Vamos a pasar a la última presentación. We'll move on, and now William Pettigrew will talk about the changing structure of investment in the English slave trade between 1660 and 1740.
So thank you to Pedro, Jonathan, and Manuel for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. I'm going to talk less about the sort of on-the-ground commercial organization of the Asiento, and more about the Asiento's sort of broader significance in the English slave trade. I am going to be talking mainly about the national framework of England. And, you know, deliberately, I'm talking about the significance of the place of the Asiento in the definition of English commercial life. So not just practically England, but the idea of England and then Britain. And what I'm trying to suggest is that the Asiento is perhaps more significant as a sort of prospect in English commercial history than as a reality. I think Nuala Zahedi is talking about the phase when the Asiento became a quite significant commercial prospect was actually in an informal way through independent merchants in Jamaica. But the official version of the Asiento, that is managed through state-sponsored monopoly companies, is a colossal failure. And I think that has important consequences for not just the history of the slave trade, but also the history of Britain more generally. There are 3 points I want to make about the significance of the Asiento. Firstly, of course, the Asiento is most significant for those enslaved people transported under its arrangements. But there are 3 further significant ways in which the Asiento is important in English history. Firstly, as a form of financial seduction, the Asiento is used as a prospect to attract investment at pretty much every stage of the first half century of English slave trading. So it's there in 1660 when the Company of Royal Adventurers is founded, and then it's there throughout the 1680s and 90s as a way of justifying state intervention in the trade. And then again, most famously, it's there after the Treaty of Utrecht and the formation of the South Sea Company. And as I mentioned before, the second significance I want to point to is the Asiento as a kind of rhetorical strategy it's introduced into political debate in a sort of tactical way as a prospect, a sort of El Dorado that will steer debate towards particular policy outcomes. So it's more important as a prospect than as an outcome. And in fact, that rhetorical strategy leads to policy justifications that are slightly unconnected from the Asiento itself. And those are really about two things. One, state finance, financing the British government after the War of Spanish Succession. And two, trying to sustain a clear and serious state role in the development of overseas trade in the 18th century. The prospect of using the Asiento, because of the way in which policymakers in the 17th and 18th century thought about overseas trade, people believed that the Asiento could only be managed by a state-run organization, by a state-backed organization. Because the Asiento was, effectively the fruit of international diplomacy, you had to have a sort of quasi-governmental body to deliver the contract. And because everybody assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that the Asiento would be hugely profitable, the prospect of the Asiento helps to keep government and the state right at the center of commercial regulation across the second half of the 17th century and into the 18th century. So that's a kind of high-level description of the three things I want to say, but I'm going to try and say those again in the context of a narrative sequence. The English slave trade, as many of you will know, doesn't really get going until the middle of the 17th century. Before 1660, it's managed sort of sporadically by merchants from the West Country and then elite merchants from the City of London. From 1660, there's a royal state-sponsored monopoly company introduced, the Company of Royal Adventurers. And the kind of pan-European dynastic elites who are involved in the foundation of that company and those elite merchants involved in setting it up have the sort of diplomatic connections that place them in the conversation about the Asiento. And so the English company, along with others, plays a part in honoring the Asiento contract in the 1660s. That company falls foul of the Anglo-Dutch War and is effectively bankrupted. Some of its shareholders have their investments transferred to a new company in 1672, a company known as the Royal African Company, which is very similar in lots of ways, although it doesn't have the clear connection to the Asiento contract that its predecessor does. The African Company is typically described as a failure, a commercial failure. But actually from 1672 to 1688, it's a remarkably successful organization, not just as a slave trading organization, but also as an investment. Those 220 investors who subscribed their capital to found the company, if they held their shares for 15 years or so, they would have doubled their money. So it was not just a successful investment, but as a slave trading company, it was profoundly successful. In fact, if you look at the slave voyages data, it's the single most prolific slave trading organization in the history of the transatlantic slave trade. But in 1688-89, the state royal dynastic backers who'd been involved in the slave trade since the 1660s are effectively forced out of England, and William of Orange becomes, the Dutch monarch becomes King of England. And this creates some problems for the company because it doesn't have the kind of state support that it had before, and its monopoly no longer looks tenable. Now, where has the Asiento gone in all of this? Well, what happens in 1690 is that the Royal African Company loses its enforcement power in the courts, and then is subject to a kind of public deliberation, a public debate, which lasts all the way to the Treaty of Utrecht, about how the slave trade should be managed. And what I'm suggesting is that the Asiento, or the prospect of the Asiento, plays a very important part in how that debate unfolds and how it is resolved. Effectively, the commercial argument in favor of having a company, the economic argument, has been lost. Because if you look at my one slide, you can see in red, those are the number of slave trading voyages per year managed by independent slave traders. In blue, you have the Company of Royal Adventurers and the Royal African Company. And then in green, you can see the slave trading voyages by the South Sea Company under the terms of the Asiento. But it shows you pretty clearly that the independent slave trade is a trade that produces a much larger capacity of slave trading. But the interesting thing is, despite losing the economic argument in this public debate, the Royal African Company manages to sustain itself, and this has important consequences for the history of the slave trade and the history of commerce in general for the 18th century. And what I'm suggesting is one of the ways it's able to sustain itself is by attaching itself to this idea of the prospect of the Asiento. So in this public debate, there are sort of three areas in which the Asiento helps the Royal African Company defend itself to a state and public audience. The first one of those is about the financing of the war itself. Independent merchants have begun to say that actually, the taxes paid by an expanded trade were paying for the war. But the African Company was beginning to suggest that actually the way in which the reality of state finance was better understood in the context of corporate loans. So you wanted to create an environment where companies were supported, like the Bank of England and the East India Company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other topic that the Asiento helps the Royal African Company in this public debate with is, broadly speaking, the history of political economy. What happens in this public debate about the future of the slave trade is basically the model of the Asiento itself, which is, broadly speaking, to provide a guaranteed supply of enslaved people. This notion of a contract is then deliberated on in a national context. So people begin to think about, well, if you have a free trade, and you can see in my chart that the number of voyages per year is quite unstable. It goes up and down quite a bit. This is one of the arguments against free trade, is that you can't have a guaranteed supply. But the Asiento is all about a guaranteed supply, and so this notion of a contract in which you would force a slave trading company to supply a minimum number of enslaved people, or, expressed a different way, a minimum export of English goods, was resorted to often in debate and really helped to make a public justification for the African Company. The other thing is that the other topic that the reference to the Asiento helps with the African Company's future is really about how people understood how trade should be managed in general, international trade in particular. It was throughout the 17th century, international trades had to be managed by state-backed companies because trade had a sort of diplomatic element to it, and because if you left trade to the vagaries of individuals acting on their own, then you'd have this very unstable, oscillating picture. So the prospect of the Asiento also helps the African Company position itself as an example of a trade and a trading entity that offered sufficient government for international trade, that often offered sufficient diplomatic machinery to conduct trade properly. Now, who won in these political debates that lasted between 1690 and the Peace of Utrecht? Well, the Africa Company successfully lobbied to have a statute to support its existence, but it was no longer able to enforce its monopoly. So, in effect, the transatlantic slave trade was freed for independent merchants to participate in. But the African Company's charter was not cancelled, and in fact, throughout that political debate, the Africa Company received very important political support because as the War of Spanish Succession proceeded, and as a Tory government took over, under the leadership of Robert Harley and in dialogue with those people negotiating the Treaty of Utrecht, a slave trading company was to be the organization not only to handle the Asiento contract, that was a crucial part of the negotiations, but this slave trading company was designed to be an entity that would pay for the cost of the war itself. And so those are two things that fasten the Asiento right into the center of English history in this period. The consequences of this deregulation of the trade, though, are as you can see in the chart, massive expansion, excuse me, massive expansion in the capacity of the trade, but also shifting the geography of the trade away from London to Bristol and Liverpool, but also shifting the geography of the trade in America away from the Caribbean and towards the mainland, the American mainland, and also shifting the geography of the trade on the west coast of Africa away from the Gold Coast further to the west and to the south. So it has a kind of important consequence for the geography of the slave trade in general. The other thing that's quite interesting about this is the Asiento in the 1660s had been the fruit of this kind of commercial dynastic pan-European elite. But the companies always disputed the idea that they were elite organizations, that they were just bodies designed to make people who were already rich still richer. Because they pointed out that anyone could buy shares in a company. You didn't have to have the wealth to establish a trading syndicate. And I think there is some truth in that. So what happens by the time we get to the Asiento in 1713 is because the African Company is still around, it becomes a more accessible means for English people to invest in the slave trade. So just to put this into some perspective, in 1660, when the Company Royal Adventurers is founded, it has 23 investors. When the African Company is founded, it has 227. Once the slave trade is deregulated, you have, on average, about 500 merchants participating in the trade in any year, and about 400 or 450 investors in the African Company. But by the time you get to the South Sea bubble, you have about 3,100 investors in the African Company alone, and many, many more thousands investing in the South Sea Company. So what I'm saying is the Asiento starts off as a kind of elitist pan-European project, but becomes a kind of democratizing force in share ownership, with, going back to this theme of gainers and losers, with calamitous results for the English economy. So that is that's the point about the social basis of investment, that is part of a larger project I'm working on at the moment, but is really only just starting. So what are the consequences of the African Company surviving once its commercial importance has been undermined by the deregulation? It creates a vehicle for completing the Asiento contract. It creates a vehicle for broad-based social investment in slave trading. But because it can no longer win the commercial and economic argument, it has to justify its existence in other political ways. And one of the really interesting things, one one of the really interesting ways in which it does that is it begins to think of a relationship between British commercial interests and West Africa that is much more sympathetic to the interests of Africans. So that by the time you get to the 1730s, 1740s, and 1750s, you have an organization founded to conduct the slave trade that is beginning to suggest that the worst brutalities and evils of that trade are actually associated with deregulation. So it's a bit far-fetched, but there is a way in which the idea of the Asiento as a state-regulated contract becomes a part of the justification for reining in the brutalities of the trade in general by the time you get to the middle of the 18th century. So there are just 6 sort of summative points I would end on about the significance of the prospect of the Asiento in British history. My view is that it really does shape an alternative model of slave trading for the 18th century that had lost its commercial vitality. That is the idea of a corporate management. It is absolutely crucial in fastening state interest and state initiative to the trade, not only in 1660, but also in 1713. As Nuala Zahedi has said, it's absolutely crucial to the development of Jamaica as a slave trading hub. And it really rehabilitates this idea that overseas trade should be managed by state entities or state-backed entities like these companies. Of course, it plays a crucial part in the securing of peace in Europe in 1713. And the final point, it plays a central part in diffusing investment, producing economic involvement in the slave trade that's much more broadly based socially. And like I said, if you'd invested in the African company at its foundation and you sold your shares after 15 years, you did extremely well. If you invested at any other point, unless you're a speculator, you lost almost everything. So, you know, we're talking about thousands of people becoming involved in slave trading investment. Most of them lost their money. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now collect questions. We'll have around 30 minutes for the debate and for the discussion. So if you have any question, please. Thank you.
Gracias. Yo tengo una pregunta para Manuel. Está interesantísimo toda tu data explicando todas estas cadenas de pagos y de crédito que se monta alrededor del comercio de esclavos. Pero lo que sí está clarísimo es que estas compañías penden de un hilo que es la colocación y la realización digamos, la venta final de los esclavos en América misma, ¿no? Entonces, ahí tú ves la fragilidad de estas compañías, porque al final, si no tienen buenos enlaces en América, nunca van a poder ser exitosas, ¿no? Y claro, en el caso del Perú, claro, lo que sucedió es que los profesionales peruanos armaron tales consorcios que fue prácticamente imposible que entraran las compañías europeas o sevillanas al territorio, ¿no? Entonces ahí tú ves esa fragilidad. Más es un comentario que una pregunta, ¿no? Porque, o mi pregunta sería, ¿quiénes eran los enlaces de estas compañías dentro del territorio, ¿no?
Thank you very much, all four speakers, for really inspiring papers. This is a question that really only has been touched upon by some speakers yesterday and at the margins, but it's a really question for all speakers. William briefly touched upon it when he said that at the very end of the development he described, the argument came up that a state-regulated asiento, a state-regulated slave trade might help curb excesses of violence and brutality. My question really is to all the speakers is in how far the question of the legitimacy of the slave trade in the Catholic context, in the Spanish context, hotly debated, continuously debated, for instance, among moral theologians, but also at lower levels of government and society. In how far do considerations of the legitimacy of the slave trade play into the documentation, are evident in the documentation, play into considerations? The documentation that you have, for instance, laid out about the traders having to lay open where the slaves are coming from, that is, and how have they been purchased. That, of course, is the question that very, very much exercises moral theologians and jurisprudence in the leading Spanish universities, the very people who train the officials who will, govern the Asiento, discuss the Asiento, to say, well, actually, yes, we know the empire needs the slaves. It's a greater good that justifies unnecessary evil, but there have to be some rules, some regulations, or else. So my question really is are any of these considerations, any of these concerns present in your documentation, present in the discourses you're dealing with? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Yo tengo dos cuestiones, una para Manuel y otra para Filipa. Manuel, gracias por tu presentación. Mi cuestión está un poco relacionada con los periodos de retorno para estos mercadores inversores como Diego Enríquez, porque las deudas y los créditos en retraso es un problema recurrente de la trata de los esclavos. Todos estos contratadores tienen créditos en retraso y después has tocado el comercio colonial con el azúcar. Me pregunto si esta participación de estos contratadores y mercaderes en la trata de azúcar es una forma de ramificar sus negocios para obtener retornos más rápidos y cumplir con sus pagamentos, o si notaste que sucede lo opuesto, que participa en el comercio de esclavos solo, o no solo, pero principalmente para penetrar en este negocio colonial y empezar haciendo sus tratos con mercancías como el azúcar, y después, a pesar de los problemas y de los créditos de la trata de los esclavos, si su intención principal no sería el acceso al comercio colonial. And the second question is for Filipa. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I really liked that you framed this profitability of the trades in different clusters, because I very much agree that you cannot put them all in the same basket, in the sense that the people who freight the ships and sometimes the people who are just providing an insurance, sometimes they don't even have a share on the slave ship, so they don't even care if the slaves arrive or not, as long as they get their fair share. However, with that being said, in these few rare cases of Belmont and other cases of where we get a massive glimpse of traders who actually participate in all of these single clusters, if it is possible to actually get from the evaluation of this kind of, as you framed it, these triangular sources, which are notarials and institutional and state sources, if looking at those together and we map them as small, as you mentioned, network analysis, if we compare cases like Belmont with other cases where we get this kind of broader picture, if then it's possible to get a small glimpse of what quantification would be. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting session. My consideration is to Filipa Ribeiro, was really enjoy also a lot, no? But you are really centering. I think I agree with you that is necessary to don't analyze these questions through the national or even imperial perspective, but also when you speak about the economics gains and the economic perspective of this element, I think we have also put in, and you have some consideration about, but I think in this period, at least in a way very, very strongly, we have to go beyond this economic element to understand other kind of profits related with the kind of society or the kind of ways of promotion, individual promotion, on corporative promotion for a lot of people, and also for the political stability of this political structure structure, for instance, like the Spanish monarchy. No? We have spoken yesterday about the impact of the War of Succession in the different towns, no? The provision of the slave traders on the contraband, all the elements they provide to these towns, and this autonomy for the local communities were really in the center of political and economic stability for these areas that explain that they no get in revolution, they don't change of position, but also related with this one William Pettigrew, the Asiento and the trade related with the Asiento has also a very strong impact in the international position of the different situation and the perspective for the traders. And for instance, thinking about Belmonte and the moment of the progression is really strongly related with the truce of between Spain and the Dutch. And we have thinking about Alberto Rodriguez, he is writing now, he just finished his thesis about the non-state actors that were in the origin of the truce peace. And this one were these kind of traders that push very strongly to this stability that provoke also some kind of economic benefits or other kind of different element. And just another very important element, there is the promotion, the personal promotion of a lot of these traders. I spoke yesterday about Belmonte, who get, even if he was a Sephardic, he was a baron and he was a count of the Holy Roman Empire, and he was in the center of the sociability of the Amsterdam situation, and he promoted himself a lot of people there. But Francesco Ferroni, for example, this one you speak about, who is essential in the control of the Asiento, Grillo and Lomelin, finally he was a lot of difficulty to promote socially in the Netherlands because it was a very close society and very oligarchical and very difficult to promote, but thanks to all these trade affair where he was involved, he finishing in Florence, like the right hand of the Grand Duke di Toscana, and was a very important promotion for his family and also for a lot of trade elements. So this kind of indirect element so essential and maybe no accountability, no, you can't count directly, but was really related with that. And I think, sorry to put another element, not just the administrative gains that you put there in something like indirect, but I think all these kind of things are important also.
Thank you, Manuel. Pedro?
Thank you for the four speakers, really interesting and thought-provoking session. I have a question to William that goes very much in the same direction of Harold's. So you've mentioned the public debates that were going on about this framework for organizing trade in the end of the 17th century and beginning of the 18th century. Could you give us more information about this? What kind of debate are we talking of? For instance, discussions that reached the periodicals published in London. At the time, London was one of the cities in Western Europe that had more periodicals being published on a regular basis. And the reason why I ask is because one of the things that I think that comes out from this session, also some of the papers that were given yesterday, is that there is perhaps the need to invest more in what we could be termed the social history of the Asiento. So taking into account all parties involved and the social perceptions, the discussions that this way of organizing trade were generating in Western European countries, in America, but of course also in Africa. So it would be interesting. Of course, the sources are really difficult to assess this, but to see to what extent the African counterparts of this trade were also had the perception that one thing was to deal with independent merchants, and a completely different thing would be to deal with merchants operating within an Asiento framework. Of course, Felipe and Miguel, for the Portuguese context, have conducted some research on this topic, but I think that might be also an important, and David Witt also has suggested that very clearly yesterday. I know the sources are complicated, but again, and David has a great responsibility in this to bring the Africans into this picture, make the Atlantic history I mean, take into account the African, the many and highly diversified African actors in all this story, not just in America as Pablo has done, but also in Africa and the negotiations taking place on the African coast. But I'm also very much interested, like Harold, in learning more about this, what you've mentioned at the end of your paper, William, this, the fact that this more state-sponsored framework for trade ended up having an impact on the perception of all the violence associated to this trade. So could you please elaborate a little bit more on that? And the second question is for Pablo. Your really interesting material tells us a lot about the Africans, women and men enslaved, taken to America, but also about the concerns of the slave owners to make these, so to say, purchases legitimate. You've presented in your first slides some of the documents they tried to put together in order to assert that, but you ended up concentrating more in other aspects of the process. But I would ask you to tell me more about their concerns. Were they concerned about, for instance, the conditions under which these women and men were purchased in Africa? Was this crucial for then later on, once in America, once in Nuevo Reino de Granada, to demonstrate that they were legitimate enslaved persons, or was it more like for fiscal purposes? So it's my question. It's, again, a question, but also a request for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for this wonderful panel. Actually, I have a question for William. Very interesting presentation. Actually, I want to ask you about this, exactly as you are mentioning, like the presence, you insisted very much in the hard work that elite merchants and political groups had to do in order to create this narrative regarding the importance of the asiento, like, and the sustainability and stability of this specific structure. And now I am curious about the responses these political groups and political debates had regarding the liberalization and, as you call, democratization process that it became at the end of your period. What they did, how they responded to that, you know, what regarding these maybe unexpected results with the losses, with the instauration of slave societies and the brutality that you mentioned at the end of your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like also to say that if somebody who is connected remotely wants to ask something, you can raise your hand and we'll collect your questions. So I would just have one or two questions. The first one is for Manuel. Manuel, te quería preguntar si también tienes alguna forma, porque imagino que sea difícil, de tener los costes. Es decir, de integrar los costes en tu análisis desde el punto de vista metodológico, porque si pensamos en otros tipos de asientos, como los asientos de dinero, los asientos de galeras, que creo también tenemos que considerar porque nos pueden ayudar mucho desde el punto de vista metodológico, pues investigaciones han mostrado que es importante ¿no? integrar los costes dentro de esa reflexión porque son un elemento fundamental para luego analizar los retornos. ¿no? And that's the sense too of my first question for Filipa. So if you, when you're talking about gains, do you want to calculate returns, or do you want to calculate revenues in the sense that the money that you could get from the slave trade? And if you want to measure returns, so maybe the cost will be a part of the equation too. And the second point is about the social distribution of these gains. So maybe, because you have presented this very nice distribution about sectors, and maybe because you're talking about this commodity chain, and we know that this methodology to analyze the social distribution of gains, we have talked before of the shareholders, the producers, the investors. So I do not know if it's one of your objectives, let's say. For sure, it's a very difficult thing, but thank you very much. So first, Manuel, if you want to answer to the different questions that have been raised, thank you. I would just ask you to be as concise as possible. Thank you very much.
Don't worry. Soy breve. ¿Esto funciona?
No.
Ha muerto. ¿Se me oye? No.
A ver, sigue.
Hola, no. Sí, ahora,
Ahora
ya.
sí.
Vale. Vale, soy breve. Margarita, sí, los enlaces para los años 90 son muy potentes. De hecho, en realidad forman parte de las élites de los puertos más importantes. Se han hecho indispensables en la gestión capitular. Incluso hay algunos que no parecen ser portugueses y lo son. Y están implicados en préstamos a la corona, naturalizaciones hacia otros compatriotas. Es decir, tienen un enganche magnífico. Eso comienza en los 50 y es un proceso imparable. Hay algunos artículos muy viejos sobre Santo Domingo, era Portugal, ¿no?, de Batallón. Y bueno, eso era ya una realidad. Sin eso hubiera sido imposible, como lo tenían en África, claro. Entonces, bueno, se produce además un fenómeno muy interesante de vuelta. Es decir, no me da tiempo a explicar todo, pero hay incluso armadores que están en Veracruz o armadores que están en Cartagena y lo que hacen es mandar el dinero o le encargo a Sevilla para que se organice un armazón. O sea, que hay iniciativa que viene de América, no solamente viene de Europa. Y desde los años 80, 90 eso es normal, entre comillas, ¿no? Eso, claro, lo permite de una forma muy potente y está en la élite. En cuanto a la legitimidad del comercio en la documentación, or the legitimacy in the documentation, in the notary records there are no such notices about this. Maybe in other sources, but not particularly in the sources I use. Maybe my colleagues have more answers about that. Y la cuestión de Miguel, es que fue antes, el huevo o la gallina. Yo creo que Godiño decía, en el tomo 2, 3, no me acuerdo, decía, vamos a ver, si los portugueses se espallaron por toda Asia, por África, ¿cómo no se iban a meter en los tratos de Castilla? Pues qué tontería, pues claro, lo hacen igual. Entonces lo que ellos hacen es complementar el negocio con otros que ya tienen. Esos son los maestros de la conexión de espacios. En el contrato de Guinea, que hemos visto, una parte del marfil se queda para el trato con la India, de donde vienen los cauris, vienen los paños con los que se visten, vendemos al rey de Benín o al rey de donde sea, y con eso sacamos esclavos. Yo creo que es una diversificación. Ahí había ejemplos que no podía hablar, en los cuales en realidad, es que hay una cosa que no he podido decir. La gente que está ahí son vecinos todos de Sevilla, son portugueses, pero de segunda o de tercera generación. Entonces, claro, ellos tienen la conexión perfecta. Entonces, ellos están comerciando con América, es lo que quiero decir. O sea, no solo con África, con India, ya comercian con América. Entonces, lo mismo que están armando los barcos, comerciando con África, están, por otro lado, enviando en compañía con Cuba, con Veracruz, sus propios tratos, complementando los problemas de la llegada de crédito. ¿Qué pasó con estos contratadores? Que fiaron mucho a la espera de la flota no llega. Y el capitalismo no perdona. Es el problema que tienen, ¿no? Luego lo arreglan, pero les cuesta mucho trabajo. Entonces, ¿qué fue antes? Yo creo que las dos cosas van de la mano. Y la cuestión, y voy acabando, la cuestión, por ejemplo, de la hierba esta que yo he comentado, claro, ellos son los amos de la importación de pastel. Ellos distribuyen, los mismos canales de distribución del pastel por Andalucía y por el sur de España son utilizados para introducir el azúcar. Son iguales, son los mismos. Es muy interesante. Y los PAS, que antes he hablado también con Edgar, están metidos en eso también desde lejos. Pasa que están en Brasil, pues también están en Puerto Rico, es otro tema, ¿no? Así que la magia es complementar, si falla una cosa viene la otra. Y, claro, el cálculo de costes no lo he metido porque es muy complicado. Y el problema es que, claro, tú puedes hacer el cálculo de costes para unos armazones. Para todo el contrato es muy complicado porque se omiten datos, pero el problema es que lo tienes que añadir al resto de los negocios para entenderlo, que es lo difícil, y eso no me da tiempo a hacerlo aquí ni loco. Pero sí te puedo decir que lo que es solo un armazón, lo que es la pieza de esclavo, que vale tanto, eso puede costar 40 ducados, 50 como mucho la licencia. O sea, entre la licencia y los impuestos son una parte importante, muy importante. Entre la licencia y los impuestos prácticamente todo. Los otros costes son más bajos, adquisición, mantenimiento del esclavo en el viaje, etc. Son los impuestos lo que sería la parte del león, la parte más importante. De ahí la evasión fiscal, de ahí meter muchas más personas esclavizadas dentro del barco para luego cubrir los impuestos con los que tú vendes ilegales. Entonces, el coste se puede calcular, se puede hacer para armazones, pero complementarlo con otro negocio es más complicado porque es a la larga duración, que tardan los retornos en llegar 1 año y medio, 2 años, según la flota, como decíamos, ¿no? Entonces, eso es difícil, pero se puede hacer. Luego hay que sumar el coste de la traída, de la vuelta, y lo que cobran las encomiendas y lo que cobra el que lo lleva, pero eso que venía es un 8% del ingreso, o sea que queda limpio una cantidad bastante considerable, pero no te puedo hacer un cálculo exacto porque no me ha dado tiempo, pero lo haré para el artículo.
Gracias. Muchas gracias. We'll follow the order of the presentation. So, Philippa, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments and your questions. I will try to give a general answer because I think there's a lot of points that are common to the different questions. Maybe starting with the issue of the gains. One of the reasons why I ended my presentation saying that we need to move beyond the numbers is exactly because I think even though there is data that allows for quantification, especially if we focus on specific case studies for specific periods, it will not be possible to quantify for all the regions involved and for all the actors involved. And there's things that cannot be quantified, as for example what Manuel was saying, the gains that you have from participating in these activities that are not measurable, but are very significant. So that's one of the reasons why I think all this debate for the past decades has focused a lot on quantifying profits, which is important because it's important to have a sense of the magnitude. That's what I don't imply to say that numbers are not important, but they do not translate the significance and the impact of the trade, both in enslaved Africans and in the output of enslaved labor. So that's why I think if we want to study gains, we have to move beyond this conception of only quantifying and look at gains beyond, the profits of slave trading or of selling slave-produced goods, and look at what people gain beyond these profits. Beyond the money, look beyond the money. Not that the money is not important, and I think quantification is important, and you need to have case studies that can really illustrate how the different people involved in these different clusters of gains, how much money they make, as far as we can quantify, of course, because data is limited to a certain extent, but it's possible with case studies to do this. But then also look not only at the big players, which has been the focus of all this narrative, but look at other people down the chain, especially people that are at the bottom of the chain, like the retailers, for example, and even the consumers. And this touches on your question of the social distribution. So in fact, who is gaining from this and who is gaining the most and who is gaining how and how much. And the how much is, I think, the most difficult part to calculate in quantitative terms, but you can also make an estimate in social terms, in political terms, in economic terms. And I think that's why it's important to move beyond the numbers. And that's one of my points. Then the other point that was touched, I think, by Harold indirectly, but also by Pablo when she was presenting, and I think it's very important, is that I presented this as a story of gains, but this is also a story of losses. Losses for the African enslaved people, but also a lot of losses also for the people that are involved in the business, because we only talk about stories of success. But there's also a lot of losses that, and there's a history to be done of the losses from the Atlantic slave trade, because the business was profitable, but the risks were very high. And that's something that also needs to be accounted for. And I think these losses, to a certain extent, in the case of the Portuguese, they are not examined very carefully except for a few cases, but they, I think, reflect the legislation that are going to be issued by the Crown at the end of the 17th century that tries to regulate the trade itself and the brutality of the trade, and that touches on the point of Harold. I'm not aware of any specific debate, because this is a topic I have not studied before, within the Portuguese sphere that leads to this legislation, but usually royal legislation in the Portuguese context derives from requests or petitions of people from within the colonies or within the court that request the issuing of legislation to solve a problem. So I think there was a discussion, which I have not examined, that has led to the issue of this legislation at the end of the 17th century, probably identical to discussions that are going on in Britain, but I don't think this has been studied for the Portuguese case, but this is something that really deserves attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being very concise too. Paula, if you want to answer to the questions that have been made. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I believe I have an only question, and it's regarding the legitimacy, which both asked, and thanks for this question, which is, I think, one of the deeper questions that we need to understand in this kind of topic. And first, to say that when the Crown requested the ordenanzas for Antioquia, mainly was interested in knowing if the captives came within a license or later within within the asiento and the license regarding that asiento. And secondly, if they paid completely the taxes, the quinto, to the Crown. So those were the 2 points that they had to prove. So they were not interested in Africa at all, but they need to restructure all the way in which the people were inserted into America, and that's why they constructed that complex, like that complex documentation. But then we also have the legitimacy in Africa, which is very, as you said, is very complex to approach, mostly because we have not been in the West, we have not been interested for the African history. So it's not so much that it's complicated, the documentation, but that we don't know the documentation. We have not started even to approach to it. And in this sense, I believe, and this is something that I was wanting to tell to Filipa also as a comment, that we cannot think in the gain in terms of continents in the case of Africa, and even in the case of Europe, I believe, because we need to speak about elites. The elites that were gaining and that were involved. But when we thinking the captives that are, of course, as important as the elites, then we see that there's an illegitimacy, and that's why many people were running away in America and also in Africa, because I was reading yesterday that even in some ships in Guinea, 30 or 40 of the population that were already in the vessel made it to return to the continent and run away. So when we think in the concept of the runaway, of the escapee, of the amount of population that established maroon communities and that were opposed to the slave trade and to the slavery, then we think in the legitimacy in another perspective, even in Africa and in America, and also in Europe, of course. And then because it has been like so easy for the especially for the European historiography, but also for the American elites who still today, as us, do the historiography, to wash their hands regarding the legitimacy, saying that they were purchased in Africa, and that's it. And then all that was created in Africa was that vast violent process that was introduced to the continent from like very short years, and I think that Toby Green has done like a very strong point on this regarding the inflation created in the African states and societies by the dumping of that specific products that were the monies or were the means of interchange, like clothes and shells and metals, also copper, so all those, and also Asian clothes that were coming, as Filipa said, from Asia. So how that impacted the society, and then how they had to respond by furnishing enslaved, which were the only means to maintaining an economy for their societies, as they were pressed by the slave trade, and a trade in which they cannot participate with their own vessels, with their own companies, even if we have much documents in the African side asking for those vessels, asking for the participation, for the commercial participation, and that was denied. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Williams, if you want to answer the last question.
Thank you for the questions. Eric Williams didn't like capitalists and he didn't like abolitionists. So for his argument to work, he has to characterize the abolition as an act of deregulation. So I think that view has kind of has swum back in time to influence the way we think about earlier stages in the history of the slave trade. My point being that abolition is not an act of deregulation, it's an act of regulation. And therefore, because of the strength of connection between the Asiento and other forms of regulation, which are companies, we can begin to see the connection between these different incarnations of regulatory activity, albeit with very different ambitions across time. But the common theme is that regulation from after the period of the Treaty of Utrecht tends to build a picture that wants to rein in the brutality of the trade. That's my first point. On the public debates, they really revolve around two issues. What is the meaning of liberty? The two sides disagree about that. For the independent traders, it's basically access to trade. But for the company, it's access to property rights in charters. The second point of debate is about defining the national interest. For the independent merchants, that is effectively the interest of the population. For the company, it's the interest of the state. But there are many more issues at stake in that public debate, and I'd be very happy to say more. I would want to just come in on this point about Africa. Of course, the concept of Africa is too blanket a device to use in this context. But I've studied pretty carefully what are the African attitudes towards the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company is there to impose prices. So obviously anybody who's selling enslaved people does not wish to have prices imposed on them. So a careful treatment of the documents demonstrates that the deregulated trade is partly built by West African slave vendors themselves. So in that sense, the public debates that I mentioned are a sideshow. They're a kind of post hoc rationalization of what's already taking place on the West African coast, which is that the West African slave vendors have refused to allow European companies to impose prices. So at least in the period I've studied, so 1680s, 90s, first 2 decades of the 18th century, African slave trade vendors are able to impose prices on Europeans. So the prices are increasing. And this is, economic historians struggle to get their head around this because you've got a story of deregulation proceeding against the context of increasing prices. And that teaches you, I think that confirms the price inelasticity of slave labor. Such was the extent of the demand, you would want to buy more and more, even if the price was increasing. So the African dimension is absolutely central. The final question, I think that the democratization of access to the slave trade is partly a response engineered by those leaders of companies who'd been accused of being elitist. So in the public debates, the companies are often depicted as dominated by wealthy existing merchant families. But they quite often rebutted that claim by saying, well, look, it's much cheaper to buy a share in our company than it is to mount a voyage yourself. And you know, that's true. So this notion that companies should be associated with mercantile elites is undermined by what happens after the Asiento, which is a sort of democratization of access. Really interesting question you followed up with, which is, you know, what effect, if you've got, let's say, 5,000 investors in the Asiento who lose all their money, how does that change their attitude to the slave trade? And do they start to become active investors in other ways, or is that underpinning the slow but sure public reaction to the brutality of the trade that, you know, could well be connectable to the perception that it is not some kind of route to riches. Once you understand that it's not profitable, then you can start to chip away at its immorality.
Thank you very much for these presentations, these answers, your questions for sure. We'll now have 20 minutes for a break. It's a bit short, but I would like to ask you to be here at 12 so we can begin with the next session. Thank you very much.